Good day. Welcome to today's lecture. What we're going to be doing is taking a look at some of the perspective tools that are inside Adobe Illustrator, and your end result is going to be to create some sort of a building, pretty much a stock 2D drawing class project. And so what we're going to do is kind of emulate that and look at that inside Illustrator. What you see in front of you here is a building that I drew. That I tossed in a couple of trees and some text, some crappy clouds. Actually, I think those are pretty crappy trees too. There's no shadows, but I did make some sidewalk thickness and a door that actually says door, in case you were wondering what that white thing on the right hand side was. It's a door. Anyway, so first of all, before we go ahead and get started, let's take a moment or two and talk a little bit about perspective and the perspective grid inside Adobe Illustrator. So what is perspective? Well, we're not going to be looking at the type of perspective that compares a liberal fanatic to a right-wing nut job to the people that are ambivalent and don't really care or drink beer. All of the above. Now, what we're looking at specifically here is the concept of linear perspective. The human eye is looking in one particular direction, and what do they see? What I've got here is a few examples of something called forced perspective, where you've got the camera sitting at a certain spot, and you've got elements that are in the foreground and the background, and people try and make them fit. And sometimes they're quite funny or scary, and sometimes they do a really nice job. Other times, sometimes the shadows get in the way. Like this one is great because you've got one person's shadow and then there's no shadow from there. But the one on the left here is pretty good. And so the idea of perspective is really what the human eye is looking at, and this is something that gets covered in pretty much every art class in the history of the world. I don't think you'd ever have an art class that didn't look at perspective. I don't know. Well, I suppose you could have that one teacher somewhere. All right. In Illustrator, what I've got here is I've got three examples from watercolors.com of perspective. And single point is where you are looking at a single vanishing point. What do you mean a single vanishing point? Well, if you're looking at images, and we'll go here, this is an example of a single vanishing point. As the human eye looks at some linear lines, and again we are talking about linear perspective here. As a human eye looks at linear lines, what's going to happen is they're eventually going to end up to, if the lines are all going in the same direction, they will eventually converge at a certain point. Sometimes that convergence happens way beyond the horizon. Sometimes that convergence looks like it's in view, like this one right here. You almost could see where the lines meet, even though they don't really meet. But the human eye looks like they meet. And that is a single point perspective. Looking at if you have two vanishing points where you're dealing with, this would be like a building, and you're looking at a front of a building. You may have see that the building, as you're looking at it, doesn't quite look square. And that is because, well, if you're looking at something at an angle, it's not going to look square. And then you end up with the kind of artwork that pretty much every drawing teacher will have you do, which is create an example of 2-point perspective. And sometimes the examples are fun, and sometimes you get some amazing artwork just by doing simple perspective drawings. And even in this case, this will be a person that if they turn that in for the assignment, they forgot to erase their grid. Yeah, that would be like 17 points off. But the important thing you see here is that as you're looking at something, you've got a vanishing point where elements in the image, especially in 2-point perspective, going to the left and the right, eventually disappear. Now, they're probably going to disappear off screen or off the artwork page. Or in my case, well, they don't disappear at all because I got all these pictures from, well, actually, I just binged this. Okay. Anyway, the 2-point perspective is pretty much what we're going to be looking at in this assignment. There's also 3-point perspective where you're looking at not only a left and a right vanishing point, but you'll also have either a bird's eye view or a worm's eye view, like if you're looking above a building or below a building. So when we're looking at things like this, the concept here is that you have an eye view, see linear lines, and what we're going to do is in Illustrator look at how that linear perspective happens. Okay, so let's go ahead and kick into that. So I'm going to go ahead and close this up. This is those examples. I'm going to go File, New, and stick with a nice little orientation of here. Now, we have already looked at grids and guides and following along them, and so the beautiful thing about Illustrator is that they've added in this nice little perspective guide. The perspective grid has been around in the last couple of versions. I'm going to go ahead and click it on, and by default the perspective grid is going to show up as a 2-point perspective, and it's completely editable. And what's awesome about it is that if you draw anything on it, on any one of the sides, so I'll use an example. There's the rectangle tool, and I'll choose, let's say we'll go with red, and I'll just click and I'll draw, and what it does is anything you draw will snap to the grid, and it just makes it so that it is so quick to put together the basic elements of what you'd find in a perspective image. What's also cool is that, especially in 2-point perspective, you have a left grid, you have a right grid, and those are all easily selectable. And as soon as a grid is selected, that means you can draw on it. Can you draw all the way to the vanishing point? Sure, you can try, but that's not the point of perspective drawing. I mean, if you know, the idea is just to try and get something that looks. Now, this is not a transformation editing tool. When we start playing around with the grid, it's just a guide. You want to make sure you have the grid set up how you like it first, because if you go in and you try and alter the grid after the fact, I'm just going to go click back on the grid tool, you'll see you've got a whole bunch of grid handles, and if you were to move any of the grid handles, the artwork that you drew doesn't change. Again, these are guides. They're not transformation tools. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the options that the grid tool gives. I'm going to go ahead and Control Z a whole bunch of times, and let's get back to nothing. So I've got the perspective grid turned on. First thing you have to understand is that there is a perspective selection tool. Okay, but we're just going to spend time here on the perspective grid tool. If I want to have a 1-point perspective, I have that option. What I have to do is I have to go into the view and I have to go down to perspective grid. Now here's something that unfortunately with my screen recorder you can't see, the button that says define grid. Okay, I'll take a screen grab for you. Okay, and so there's the thing that you're not going to be able to see. Why? I don't know. I need a bigger monitor. So the define grid image is an element that is view, perspective grid, define grid. Again, I'm not going to talk about why you can't see it. So the grid options that you have, there's some presets that are there. We'll go ahead and just take a look at them. First thing I'm going to show you is 1-point perspective. It's 1P normal view. And when you choose it, under the grid perspective settings, it shows you 1-point perspective, a number of points and a scale and a grid line every so many points. And you have a ton of adjustments here. It's pretty cool, as well as you can even adjust colors. Now I'm going to go ahead and click OK so you can see what the 1-point perspective grid looks like. The 1-point perspective grid is not going to give you a left and a right side. It's just going to give you a ground plane, and it's going to give you one side. If you over here on the left hand side, there's a small little icon, and this little icon is used for selecting the grid planes. And so if I were to come in here and inside, whoops, get the right one, and select the ground, then I could click on that, and that way I could draw on the ground. If I wanted to select on the left-hand side, I can click here, draw on the left-hand side, but there's no right-hand side because there's no active grid. It'll even tell you there's no active grid. So if I want to draw on one side or the other, it doesn't quite work. But here's the awesomeness about the grid tools. The grid tools are massively customizable. I could take this left grid and I could just simply grab the handle, which is at the bottom screen, and it's a circle with a dot in the middle, and I could drag that handle and I could pull it to the right. And imagine how cool it would be if you could do that on a piece of paper, especially if you were taking a drawing class. Instantaneously change your perspective. And yeah, it'd be nice if some people on TV could do it. Yeah, okay, this is not about bad pundits. Anyway, the point here I'm trying to make is that every time you see a handle, that is a control that will allow you to edit the grid. I can take and I can move my entire grid to the left or to the right by grabbing the center handle. If I want to grab the corner, I see that I got the 4-way arrow. That will allow me to move the entire grid structure. And it's important just to pay attention to your cursor. If your cursor looks like it's got a cube in it, that just means it's letting you know that you are in the perspective grid edit window. It's not a tool that's going to tell you anything. But if you move your cursor over something and it gives you like a circle, that could give you a handle that could move an element for helping adjust, well, guides. If you move over something and see a four-way arrow, that can move the entire object. If you got an up and down arrow, there you can adjust where your vanishing point is. And in a case here, all I have to do is simply move it down and I get a pretty extreme vanishing point. But I could also take up top here and pull down this grid so that it's not quite so tall. So maybe I'm thinking to myself, I like that a little better. Any option that you see can be used to customize what your grid is going to look like. And that's where you want to really spend the time at. You spend the time setting up the grid before you're starting to draw your artwork. And that is going to pay off in making the actual creation of your artwork massively simple. All right. So I'm going to go back to the View, Show Perspective or Perspective Grid, and I'm going to click the Define Grid button again. Yeah, I know you can't see it. It's right there. Okay. Yeah. Now, yeah. Anyway, and you probably, if you're smart, I'd have made a shortcut for it. But then none of your computers would have that same shortcut. That wouldn't be smart. So I want to take a look quick at a two-point perspective, and I'm only using the presets here, but I can, if I wanted to, if I could change something. If I don't like the colors, I could change all those. The beautiful thing about any of these presets is you have this option that you can make your own preset and save it. All you have to do is make some changes, and then you can give it a name. And I'm not going to do that, but you can have your own favorite preset, especially if you don't like these colors, because you're thinking to yourself, pastels. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. This is the perspective that you saw when I initially opened this up at the beginning of this lecture. The handles that you see here are very easy to move around and manipulate. You've got guidelines that allows you to set things. You've got the handles that allow you to actually move the perspective grid, so that if you wanted to take and intrude one plane into another, you're more than welcome to. It's got what's kind of interesting about this is that some of the handles actually stop after a little while. See, like it'll give you a wall kind of look until you get to a certain point, then it kind of stops. And I assume that that does that so that otherwise the picture doesn't get too busy. You can adjust your vanishing point. If I were to grab the handle on the right hand side and pull this, I can get a really extreme view. If I wanted to pull it out even farther, I could zoom out on my artboard, and I could take and I can grab this and I can pretty much extend it quite a bit. And so you can have a vanishing point that's massively off of your artboard, but that's quite all right. It all depends upon what you're trying to accomplish. The idea here is that you're setting up a image that is going to give you a basis of what you're going to draw on. Now, as you saw when I zoomed out, that it looks like the grid structure got smaller. Remember, this is just a guide. As I mentioned, this small little handle that I'm turning to the left, it stops after a certain point so that the actual grid doesn't get too dense. So that's just something. So I'm going to do a quick little view on the 3-point, so you see that perspective and define grid. Yeah, I'm not going to that other picture again. Anyway, under presets, I'll go to 3-point perspective. One thing I don't like is that I wish they had a preview. That would be really nice, to have like a little preview button. So that way you could play around with colors and stuff before you say okay. That's one of the disadvantages of this. So with 3-point perspective, it starts off with a bird's eye view, but if you go down and drag your point and you pull it up, and let me see if I can get that far enough up. Let's see. Oh great, no, it doesn't let me. It doesn't like me. Okay, if you pull it far enough up, then you can get the worm's eye view. So it really, it's just something you can do some adjustments. So what I want to do is I'm going to go into open up a 2-point perspective grid and start creating some artwork. So one of the tough parts of this assignment, especially as a teacher, is that we're always fearful that we are going to get 30 versions of the exact same damn building, and so the thing is that I'm not going to show you every little step that I did to make this example. I'm going to show you a lot of steps. I don't want to make the lecture too long, but I also want to stress that it's not a bad idea to maybe get a picture of a building or some sort of 2-point perspective that you want to do before. And actually, this lecture is going to be on a 2-point perspective, but if you want to do a 1-point or a 3-point perspective, you're more than welcome to do it. But again, I would stress it's not a bad idea to get a photograph or at least some sort of plan of what you're going to create before you actually create it. Even if you go out onto the web and look for a picture of a building, it doesn't take much to find any number of photos, whether it's something that has maybe a few curves in it or not, to something that's going to be a little more striking. Got a kind of an interesting worm's eye view right there, to something that's quite a bit complex, or something that's pretty simple, but still has some interesting looking, well, I like those stairs. They're kind of cool. The thing is that it's always not a bad idea to start with a general plan. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to zap this out, say goodbye, and start with a brand new. I'm going to go in here, go File, New, and go with the landscape orientation. And let's start by turning on the grid. So when we're putting together a building, first thing you're probably going to want to do is put up your walls. I mean, after you get a general idea of what you're going to look at. So I'm going to go to my perspective grid. Here's my 2-point. I'm not going to edit this right now. I'm going to just leave it as is. I already talked about that in the previous part of the lecture, and you know, don't want to ramble on forever. So dealing with your colors is not a bad idea. One of the beautiful things about Illustrator is they got these great color guides, and not a bad idea to maybe find one that you really like, and maybe stick with those colors. So let's say I'm thinking to myself, I'll use this Triad 2, and those would be the colors that I want to use. I could stick with these base colors, or maybe let's say that I want to use Harmony as one color for something. And when I use Harmony for something, I might then maybe say, okay, well, I want to have a slightly darker version of that. So I can come in here and I can have a slightly darker version. And if you set up your colors ahead of time, if you don't want to use a color guide, maybe you can make a bunch of swatches. Setting up those colors ahead of time is just going to save you a serious amount of time. And if you're not stoked about any of these things in color guide, go to Cooler. It's cooler.adobe.com, and it's just a great way to get tons and tons of color themes. Especially if you're stuck, if you're thinking to yourself, I don't know what kind of colors I want. Because when you're building a building, you don't necessarily want it to look like the Experience Music Project and have 50,000 colors. Although nothing against Frank Gehry, he does some amazing work. He's got this building in Vegas that looks like it collapsed in on itself. Totally awesome. Anyway, I got my little theme that I had here. Triad 2 is one that I kind of wanted. Why? Because I don't know, I liked it, and it's I made it a little bit brighter. There's Triad 2. And so I'm going to go ahead and choose the color that I want for one of the walls, and I'm just going to click on the rectangle tool. I am on the left grid, and the numbers 1, 2, and 3 allow you to choose, and I'm going to move my cursor up to the top. It's going to say intersect, and that's going to tell me that I'm at the top corner. I'm just going to click and drag my rectangle down, and I'm going to take it all the way to the bottom, and I'm going to pull the rectangle all the way off the screen. Now when you pull a rectangle too far toward your vanishing point, you may have a little bit of a problem with it locking to the bottom, and that really depends upon the control that you have of your cursor. Now if ever you're doing something and you decide, okay, I'm going to actually get rid of that, I don't like that color, you are more than welcome to change it. And it's a good idea that when you change it, throw it into the swatches so that you know it's there. That way you get some consistency. I actually like that because I want to stick with that. I'm going to use these first two. And so I'm going to go and hit the number 3 to go to the right-hand grid. I'm going to grab the other darker color here and start at the anchor and simply drag down and pull this all the way across the screen and off toward the screen to my vanishing point, and there I have my basic grid structure. Okay, now the type of thing that I was going to create is that I'm going to put some sidewalks in there, and I'm going to put some thickness on the sidewalks, and then I'll also put a general kind of ground, and so I'll start working on the sidewalks next, because the sidewalks are going to be drawn on the horizontal grid. So when I start drawing on the sidewalks, I can start at almost any place, and I'm going to go ahead and actually start off the screen to draw the rectangle for the sidewalks. And when I draw the rectangle for the sidewalks, this is when I'm going to take and use a slightly different color. I'm going to grab the color for the initial harmony rules, but I'm going to take and I'm going to turn that just a little bit more grayer. So that, I don't know, that's not a word, grayer. Oh, I don't know. Anyway, so I'm going to start a little bit off the screen, and I'm going to click and drag and pull this so that I get the perspective that head towards the vanishing point. Now, if I wanted to, I could draw one big, long square covering the entire floor. Now, when I do that, I will probably have to take and send that to the back. So that's where I'm going to hit the Control left bracket to send it back behind my two walls. Now this is also where you want to start getting used to using the shortcut key of turning that grid off every once in a while, the perspective grid, so you can see what it looks like. And that's when you press the Control Shift I and turn that off. So I'm going to go ahead and just say that I think I like that, but I think I'm going to take this ground. And I could have done it in two parts, by the way. I didn't have to do it in one part. I could have done it, made it a little bit thicker, but I'm thinking that I'm just going to make it a little bit lighter. It's just right now, it's just a little bit too light. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe instead of going lighter, maybe I'll go darker. Okay, but now if you think about all that stuff ahead of time and you make your swatches, or let's say I'm thinking I know I'm going to keep this picture, or I want this color, then that's not a bad idea to make those swatches ahead of time. It's going to save yourself a ton of time. Now I also know I want to make a small little edge here, so it gives the illusion that this sidewalk has a little bit of thickness. So that edge is going to be done, I'm going to turn on the perspective grid, that edge is going to be done on the left-hand grid. Now just because the grid is sitting in one spot doesn't mean that you actually have to draw on the grid. What? Yeah. Do you have to move the grid around? The answer is no, you don't. Okay? It will snap to that perspective, but you don't have to draw on it. And that's one of the mistakes that people make a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to choose a really, really dark gray here. I'm going to turn on the rectangle. I'm going to come down to the very bottom of this picture, and I'm going to click where it says anchor, and I'm going to draw a rectangle. And when I draw the rectangle, what you see is that it's drawing the perspective based upon me choosing, and I'm going to get pretty close in here, so that I get a nice, not too thick of a line, but I want enough thickness so it looks like it's, and that's the difference between a good mouse and a bad mouse. And this is not letting me get quite where I want to get. And I think what I'll do is I'll just cut my losses right there and come in and do some editing on this. So I drew this rectangle. It's not on the grid, but it's in the left grid view, and that allows me then to fix it. Now what happens if I wanted to actually fix that, because it's kind of thick? Well, underneath the perspective grid is something called the perspective selection tool, and what that does is that actually lets me edit something in perspective. So if I wanted to thin this out, I could just simply use the perspective selection tool, and I could thin that out just like I did right there. So that way it gives me the illusion of a sidewalk, thickness of a sidewalk, and it maintains a perspective view. Now you might be thinking to yourself, could I have gone into the regular selection tool? The answer is no. You go into the regular selection tool, it is not going to give you the editing with the perspective view. And so that is something that you're going to have to get used to, that you're going to be going into the perspective selection tool, Shift V, especially if you got something that you have to adjust. So I'm going to go to the rectangular tool. I'm going to press the number 3. That means I'm looking at the right grid, and I'm going to make a small little grid on the other side. Now the awesomeness about doing something that is that I just adjusted, I can click on the anchor, and then when I pull to the right here, I can just pull it all the way off the perspective, and it should give me a very easy ability to make the exact same height, because it will snap to place. And that's one of those awesomenesses. Is that a word? Yeah, grayer and awesomenesses is it's like truth here. You know, there's some new words. Yeah. Anyway, Control Shift I, not a bad idea to look and see what your basic looks like. Now, when I first did this, the very first version, I actually purposely did not make my sidewalk match up with the corner of my building. You don't have to at all. If I were to open that one back up, the perspective building, I purposely left one sidewalk a little bit longer than the other. How come? Because you know, sometimes if something's a little bit asymmetrical, it looks kind of cooler. It's not quite so, you know, I don't know. So let's say that you're thinking, okay, I want to put some windows. All right, so we'll put some windows. And let's say you want to put some text. All right, you want to put some text. Okay, well, let's talk about windows first. When you are drawing something that you want to place onto a perspective grid, if you want, you can actually draw it right on the perspective grid. I could come in here and I could think to myself, okay, I'm going to use this harmony. I like this really light green, and I want to draw. Now, if you attempt to draw and you forget to turn on the grid, it will just draw a nice little square picture for you. So you do got to remember that you need to turn on that grid. And then when you're drawing it, then it's just a matter of clicking on the rectangle tool and drawing to get your perspective view. And that could be one window. All right. You want to do many windows from that. Well, this is where taking and using the perspective edit tool and still getting away with the old school Alt key to duplicate windows is where you can make many windows out of one. And if you hold down the Shift key to constrain, to select, like, say, all three windows, then hold down and do an Alt drag. When you do an Alt drag, what it will do is it will drag the windows along that perspective. So all you pretty much have to do is hold down the Alt key, click and drag, and I'm still holding down the Alt key. I haven't let up on it at all. And I can just keep drawing until I run out of space to do windows. Now, if I don't even want to drag, what I could do is I could hold down the Alt key, click to the right arrow one time. What that does is that duplicates it, and then I could just keep hitting the right arrow until I get the placement of where I want the next set of windows. Holding down the Alt key, clicking the right arrow one time, gives me a whole different another set of windows. Just remember to let up on the Alt key before you hit the right arrow. Otherwise, what's going to happen is every time you hold down the Alt key and hit the right arrow, you're going to get duplicate on duplicate on duplicate. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why don't you just make a pattern and paste that pattern along the edge of the building? Patterns actually do not work with the perspective grid. You can make something that is made out of a pattern, but if you want it to be in perspective, you would then have to, after you made something with a pattern, you would have to expand it and then place it onto the grid. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So let's say that I'm going to go ahead and I'll by the way, you can click that little X to hide the grid too. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a square, and I'm going to take that square and I'm going to drag it into my symbols. And actually, no, we'll drag it into my swatches. And I'll double click on it and go into the pattern editor and separate this out just a little bit so that it gives me the illusion of like a bunch of windows. Okay, and so I'm going to do that, and I'm thinking, okay, that's pretty good right there. Now I'll go ahead and say done, and there is part of my pattern. I'll go ahead and make this just a little bit bigger. Actually, I'm going to make it a lot bit bigger. I'm going to drag this so that it's going to be probably the equivalent of 3 windows tall, and as much as I can get out of this in terms of the window. Okay, so this is filled with a pattern. Now, if I were to attempt to take, I'm going to turn back on the perspective grid, and I'm going to turn back on the perspective selection tool. If I were to attempt to take this rectangle and put it up against this wall, well, actually, let me do a quick little Control Z, because I grabbed the wrong wall, left grid, and drag it up against this wall. My problem is this, the rectangle will go, but the pattern will not. Really? Yeah. What can you do about that? Well, you can take, and if you really, really want to use a pattern, you can you just go to the object and you expand that pattern. And if you expand the pattern, then it's no longer a pattern. It's actually then just a piece of artwork that if you drag it and you place it onto your wall, will then allow you to work with it just like it's a piece of artwork. And you've got handles, so you can increase its size. You can decide how long you want it to go. The disadvantage of doing it this way is that if you stretch something out, you could elongate out your windows, and so you don't always know the exact shape that you're going to get unless you're really good at math. And that could be kind of not such a good thing if you're going for consistency. So my suggestion is that, especially if you're doing windows, just take and maybe grab just a couple windows. Now I've grabbed windows on this side, all right, which is on the right-hand side. I like to drag them to the left-hand side. Well, how do you do that? Well, if I were to do an Alt drag to make another copy, while these are selected, pressing the 1 key, I'm going to control, or it's actually hold down the shift key, select all three, and with my holding the mouse down on the cursor, pressing the one, and that shifts them to the other window. And there we go. Now I get the right size. So I kind of messed them up the first time. But this again allows me to press the Alt, and if you don't want to do it with the mouse, press the Alt key, left arrow one time, and then you get one copy. And you can get pretty dang fast at this. And it's just a matter of how many windows do you want. So how do you do this with text? Well, with text, if you were to want to type some text, you're going to find that it's not going to show up in perspective. And so let's say that I'd like to name this building, run a name across the top of it. So I'll grab Hi Mom, and I'll increase the size of this font a little bit, and I'll go ahead and Myriad Pro is kind of dull and boring. So we'll go ahead and change, well, I don't know, Nyla's kind of dull and boring too. But if this, I guess, if this is the title of a building, it probably needs to be all caps. So I want to take this and I'd like to place it on one of these walls. Well, as soon as you type, you got to remember that it's going to be flat. It is. It's not going to be in perspective mode. Illustrator does not let you type in perspective mode. However, if you have, if you're in the perspective edit window and you have the perspective selection tool selected, you can select your text, and as soon as you hold the mouse down, it will add the perspective based upon whichever grid was selected. And then you have the ability to take and grab any of the handles. You can make the fonts bigger as much as you want. And if you do want to edit it, you can still double click on it. What it does is when it puts you into the edit mode, it takes out the perspective. And so that way you can change the font, you can change the color. You can think to yourself, I really would like this to be something that's bold. All right, so don't want this lecture to keep getting too long, because right now it's starting to get into the lengthy stage. The elements that you place on your building are completely up to you. How I did the sidewalk could be easily how you make a building so that it's not square. The thing that's a concern that I kind of mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture is that if all of your buildings are boring and square, yeah, put a little bit of imagination into something. Don't make them all boring and square. Throw a couple extra things into it. Well, what do you mean a couple extra things? I could come here and I could draw like another wall. And when I draw a wall that sticks out, and I'll go ahead and I think I'll make it dark green. And I could add like a whole different section of a building. You've got all the ability to do anchors, and you could choose whatever direction you want your wall to go in. This wall that I drew here on the right-hand side was done with the left grid, but I can press the number 3 so that I can draw something on the right grid, and then I could draw an extended wall that goes farther down. And then what you got, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my grid, is that you got, you know, a nice little piece that doesn't give you just a box. It gives you something that extends out. And I put a door in it in the first one. Okay, so you saw that in my artwork, I actually had a ground. How do you make a ground? Well, a ground is easy. That's just simply a box, and then you color it with something. I'm going to color it with this, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to control left bracket, and I'm going to send it to the back. I'll do the same thing by making some sky. And some sky, I'll just start with kind of like a blue. Actually, I didn't want to do that to my ground. Quick Control Z. I'll take the rectangle tool and just draw another rectangle, and I'll send this to the back too. Arrange, send it back, and just maybe start this with kind of a, ooh, I don't really like that blue at all. Ew, that's terrible sky. And maybe make it so that it's, there we go. I'm okay with that. So that's a little bit better. So I'm going to make clouds by using, well, pretty much if Bob Ross was still alive, this would be his favorite brush. It's called the Blob Brush. What it allows you to do is it allows you to paint blobs, and anything it paints turns into a filled vector object. Here, watch. I'm going to make some nice little fluffy clouds, and they're going to be nice little fluffy clouds. And they're not that great of clouds. In fact, they actually look like crappy clouds. But when I draw them, as soon as I drew them, end up being a fill. Really? Yeah. Can I draw inside there? Sure. I'm going to draw inside there, and I'm going to fill up all those clouds with everything except I'll leave a small little area that could be like a little accent line. Or I could have painted it all the way in and then just drew in another accent line. Because when you use the blob brush, what it does is it makes a filled vector shape. And there you go. There, I have a cloud. Let me do another one. And I could use bigger. I don't have to stick with the basic size of the blob brush. How do you choose what size that your blob brush is? Well, you click on the blob brush, and then there's basic, and I'll go with 15. Make it a little bit bigger. Okay, and click. Oops, got to click on the blob brush. And here's 15. There you go. A little bit bigger. And I just paint it all the way in, or if I want to leave like a little accent line, I can do that. And there we go. There's another cloud, and that's a fill. And it might have holes in it. That's one of the disadvantages of the blob brush. Sometimes you have to go in and paint to not have any holes, or you could just say to yourself, you know, I'm happy with holes. It's okay. So I'm going to use the blob brush to make a tree. How? Well, just going to start grabbing the blob brush and drawing a tree root. And you're thinking to yourself, why are you making a tree root that's white? Well, it's not going to stay white. I'm just going to start here, and then I'm going to change the color. What? Brown. Okay? And probably would help if I selected it before I changed the color. That would help. Yeah. There you go. So, ooh, that's terrible brown. There we go. And then I'm going to make the top of the tree. And the top of the tree is going to be green, except for I don't want to accidentally turn on anything I have selected. And so I'm going to go and choose, let's see, we'll use a nice little light color green. No, that's kind of terrible. Okay, and grab the blob brush and just start making little circles. Okay, just nice little circles, and that's going to be part of my tree. Just nice little circles. There we go. Yeah, nice little circles on my tree. And there we go. You got a nice little circle. And there's my tree. There you go. That's nice. So what am I going to do with that? I want to take it and, oops, I keep selecting the wrong thing. I'm going to click the top of the tree and click the stalk of the tree. I'm going to drag it into my symbols window. So now I've got a symbol that I'm going to change to a type that's going to say graphic. Now, by the way, if you're in an older version of Illustrator, you may not see that option show up there. But I'm going to call this, there's only one name you can ever call a tree, and that's Joyce. And so there I've got a tree symbol. Now, can I get rid of the original one that I had there? Sure I can. But the advantage of making something into a symbol is that if I turn on my perspective grid and I have it say, like, I'll go with the left grid, and I drag out a symbol, then what it will do is it will want to take, and if I go and I want it to paste again itself, just go to perspective selection tool, and when I do that, it will automatically put itself in perspective, complete with giving me the corner handles so I can make a nice little taller tree. Can I make multiple ones of this? Yeah, I can do an alt drag. And just like anything, when you are working in a perspective grid, it will simply make the next one smaller. Okay? Now, also, you'll notice that I kind of put this one a little bit too much on the sidewalk. Because maybe I don't want anybody to use the sidewalk. There you go. So, so I'll take that and put that a little bit farther out. So that's a great way to populate your buildings with something. The original tutorial that I did for this lecture actually had me making a light street lamp, and had me putting street lamps all the way down the side of the building. And that was kind of cool. Yeah, it was okay. Other things, just last few things to mention, is that be careful of putting two light colors that are right next to each other. That's probably not a good idea. Can you change something? Yeah, you can pretty easily change something, but be careful if you're moving something around, because you can get some gaps. So be cautious of making a selection and accidentally clicking and moving it. But it's not a bad idea to be able to change a color, okay? Especially so that you show that you've got some things. Now, if you have something that's a symbol and you want to use the gradient mesh tool, Illustrator is going to pop up with all sorts of warnings saying, hey, they're going to expand out your arc, and then you're going to have to paint it while it's in perspective. Kind of a pain. You can, however, if you have a symbol and you wanted to use, say, just a regular old gradient on it. If I were to come in here and I think to myself, okay, well, I want to throw in a gradient here, and take and make a linear gradient. We'll start with two different colors of green. We'll start with a really dark color green and have it go to maybe a light color green, and then that's going to be this little thing right here. Just click and drag, drop it right in there, and there we go. So I got a nice little gradient. Now, since that was a symbol, then what happens is when I go back out to my pictures, they all have that nice little gradient there. So it does support gradients, but it just won't support mesh tools. Okay, or the gradient mesh. All right, so that's going to go ahead and end this lecture. You learned a little bit about perspective. You watched me play around with the Blob Brush, which can be fun as heck if you wanted to. We looked about some text, and you see a really boring kind of building there. Actually, my first one was just kind of as boring too. Although the first one I had way too much, I spent way too much time on the windows and my trees. Ooh, my trees actually in the first one sucked worse than the second one. Yeah. All right, so have fun on your project. That's all. Bye.